all of the social cultural work.
Okay, a mic check. Can everybody hear me okay? Yeah. All right, great. Well, thank you very much for sticking around till the end of the day. So one of the rules of public speaking is you don't be the last briefer of the day, particularly on a long day. So I'll try to keep this entertaining and I'll try to keep us on time here today. So I'm going to talk about trust and influence research at AFOSR. I've been with AFOSR now for about a year in this role. I've been on site for about 6 months. Real quick outline of the portfolio. I'll talk about some program trends because this is a program that's gone through some transition. I'll talk about descriptions of each of the areas for trust and influence. I'll talk about my motivation for this area as well as my strategy for engaging these topics. I'll talk about some of the grants that we're funding in this area, and you'll notice that we're talking about 2 trust grants and 6 influence grants. Trust is a relatively new topic for this portfolio, so stay tuned to next year. We'll see more of those trust topics next year. We'll talk about some recent transitions and, of course, our collaborations and synergies. So in terms of the program trends, this portfolio was originally called the Sociocultural Modeling Portfolio, and I've changed the name to Trust and Influence. The reasoning behind this is twofold. One, it introduces trust as a standalone topic within AFOSR, as evidenced by a BRI initiative that was awarded this year. So you see an increase in the trust and autonomous systems that we've heard about a few times today. I'll go into depth on that in a little bit. Increases in the cross-cultural trust area. I think this is a real big opportunity. Increases in the notion of influence effects. I'll define exactly what that is in a bit. And the cognitive mechanisms for influence. So the second issue with changing the name was I felt that this got us a little closer to Air Force relevance and Air Force needs with the influence piece. So we'll be doing less computational methods and less of the modeling work. My justification for that is I'm going to be focusing on more empirical data sets that might actually down the road be able to feed some of these modeling efforts. Very long range goals here. So in terms of the portfolio description, I'm interested in 2 things. The science of reliance, which is essentially how humans maintain, establish, and repair trust perceptions of both individuals and within technology relationships. I'm interested also in the science of influence. This is essentially understanding how to shape the behavior and attitudes of others. When we break these down into the sub-areas, let's see, how do I get the pointer to work here? Oh, there we go. So in the sub-areas, again, I'm interested in the cross-cultural trust issues. So here, I'm not so much interested in the fact that I think trust is a common process across cultures. I think most cultural groups have this notion of trust. What I think is probably different are the antecedents to that trust. What leads up to that trust is probably going to be different in some of these different cultural groups. That's something I'd like to explore. Also, the notion of trust and autonomous systems. Here I want to be able to identify the factors that shape reliance in these complex human-machine interactions. And we've heard throughout the day that Tech Horizons also calls this out as a major need area for the Air Force. In considering influence, I'm interested in understanding the behavioral effects of influence tactics. This can range from a variety of types of things, and I'll talk about some of those. In recent discussions with Air Combat Command, we've held several workshops throughout the past several months. They're very interested in this notion of being able to quantify what the effects of these tactics are, behaviorally and on attitudes. Also, we need to be able to understand the cognitive mechanisms that drive influence effects. So this is going to help us get to the understanding of why are these tactics having the effects that they do. Okay, if we understand why, we can actually forecast. We can get ahead of the game a little bit. Okay, so there's been a lot of talk about trust throughout the day. So I'd like to spend a little bit of time defining what I mean by trust and how that might be different from some of the things you may hear in other circles. So trust, to me, defined by Roger Mayer and his colleagues, who's a psychologist in management, actually, is the willingness of individuals to accept vulnerabilities from others when the person has little opportunity to monitor that performance or monitor those actions. This is actually the most accepted and most widely used definition of trust in the psychological literature. Now, I appreciate that there's also literatures that talk about trust in terms of data integrity, in terms of computers talking to each other, in terms of networks. That's not what I'm talking about here. I'm talking about the human aspects of trust. And so I make some assumptions here. Obviously, the first one is that trust is a human phenomenon. Okay? Secondly, and this is important because it's going to come up again, trust and trustworthiness are different constructs. Trustworthiness is an antecedent to trust. Trust is an intention that might lead to some behavior. So in the seminal article by Mayer and his colleagues in '95, he talked about trustworthiness as including aspects of ability, which is, I think everybody kind of knows what ability is, benevolence, which is where a person may have your intentions in mind, they're out for your good, and integrity, a person's adherence to a set of standards, a set of values. And that is the most robust model of trust in the literature as we speak. Another assumption, trust is relational. So when we talk about trust, it only makes sense in a relational context. That relationship can include other people, can include technological systems. Trust is dynamic, so it's going to be changing over time. More important to that is the things that predict trust change over time. A study by Levine and colleagues in 2006 found initially, when you just get to know somebody, it's your dispositions. It's what you bring to the situation that drives your trust of other individuals. But over time, it's how they interact with you. It's their behaviors that drive your trust. And we'll go ahead and go on for the sake of time here. Those are some of my assumptions in defining trust. So in terms of motivation, okay, we've got the seminal article here, Tech Horizons. I won't read that quote to you, but it's been said again and again, this is a significant research area for the Air Force. It's important if the Air Force is going to engage in autonomous systems and understanding these types of complex machine interactions, that we get to this notion of what is trust, how can we get at trust in these relationships, and how can we, more importantly, get people to appropriately calibrate their trust of these systems. So in terms of operational challenges, obviously the future battleground, and even to some extent the current battleground, is characterized by complex human-machine interactions. We know also that our interactions are often with different cultural groups. As our adversaries continue to use tactics that are unpredictable, things like human intelligence are going to be very important. They're going to be paramount to our success. So trust is going to be critical to that, building trust with these groups. And of course, General Schwartz talks about building partner capacity. And I think this is best exemplified by a quote from a senior military officer who was in the Anbar province of Afghanistan during some of the heaviest fighting. And he said, no amount of Kevlar can ever protect you as much as your relationship with the local people. So clearly trust is important. We need to understand how it relates to these different cultural contexts. So why is this a hard challenge? Well, we all know, maybe some of us from our own personal experiences, that appropriate reliance, so getting our trust of a system right, even our trust of a person right, is very hard. It's a difficult thing. Things like complacency or overtrust and under-reliance are common in the real world, right? So there's actually documented cases of where people have followed a GPS system driving straight into a river, right? You laugh, but it happens. And you ask these people, well, why did that happen? Well, I thought the system knew there was a river there. I mean, talk about complacency. There's also examples of complacency throughout the aviation literature. I don't have time to go into too much detail with those. But this notion of appropriate reliance is a really difficult thing. When we get to the interpersonal realm, all of the models of trust, let me say that again, all of the models of trust are based on Western models and Western ideologies. How do these translate to other cultural groups? Largely an unanswered question, a basic research opportunity for sure. We know that humans have trust biases. We think about technology and people differently. We tend to be more forgiving of people, believe it or not, than we are of technology when it makes a mistake, because we know that people aren't perfect. We tend to think that technology is perfect. Okay? So these are some of the biases we bring to the situation. And also, one of the things, when we think about trust in autonomous systems, one of the real opportunity areas from a science perspective is right here. We know very little about how human interpersonal trust models apply in this technology realm. When you look at the literatures on trust, there's a literature that talks about trust of technology. There's a literature that talks about trust of people. And guess what? They don't converge. Well, what if we start to make those literatures converge? I think that's a real science opportunity. So here's the domain of trust. As I mentioned before, I'm primarily interested in human trust. That human trust can have certain metrics associated with it. IARPA actually has a fairly large program looking at physiological and neurological markers of trust metrics. Human trust can be driven also by trust biases, as we mentioned before. These are things people bring to the situation. Trust interactions or trust relationships may occur within technology and within cross-cultural interactions. So my strategy here, I want to focus on this particular link, looking at how human trustworthiness attributes affect the human-machine interaction, and I want to focus on the cross-cultural trust issues. I realize we can't do everything. This is somewhat fairly covered. AFRL has a very large program in looking at human trust biases, led by Dr. Charlene Stokes. I know there are a lot of folks looking at autonomous systems. ONR has a lot of programs in this area. I know Paul Bello looks at machine ethics types of issues. So these are the areas that I want to focus on right here. Now, that being said, I'm not going to rule out a really strong proposal in the other areas, but I'd have to coordinate that with the other groups as well. So let's dig in a little bit and look at a couple of the trust projects. This is actually a lab task with Dr. Charlene Stokes from AFRL at Wright-Patterson. And this is a collaborative effort with actually funding from AORD with Drs. Lin from Sunway University in Malaysia and Dr. Fang Chen from NICTA in Australia. So ultimately, this project looks at contextual factors that influence trust and trustworthiness. The three factors that they were primarily looking at were relationship type. So you think about relations like you have a relationship with your spouse, your boss, your coworkers, different kinds of relationships. Cognitive load, which was the primary interest area of Fang Chen, and culture, of course, looking at differences between US, Malaysian, and Australian samples here. And so what did they do? We're all very familiar with notions of things like LinkedIn, right? Everybody hear of the tool LinkedIn? I'm sure a lot of you use that tool. Well, consider an application system like LinkedIn, where applicants would send in their data, people would process that data and send it on to hiring officials. Well, the folks at AFRL actually built a research platform like this, where ratings from supervisors were used to manipulate trustworthiness. Some of the applicants were made to look high in ability, some were made to look high in benevolence, and some were made to look high in integrity. Okay, those were those manipulations of trustworthiness. And so in this case, what they found was we're looking at a table of the percentage of applicants binned in a particular role. The roles were supervisor, other supervisor, so somebody else's supervisor, and your coworker. Now what we see, and this is actually pretty interesting, the folks that are highest in benevolence are being rated as, you know, I'd like that person to be my supervisor. You think about supervisors, that's someone you want to have your back. So that really came out really strong here. When you think about somebody else's supervisor, the notion of integrity showed up really high. So more people are being placed in that scenario that are high in integrity. Doesn't have direct relevance to you, so the benevolence isn't as important, and the notion of ability doesn't seem to be as important. When you think about coworkers, though, people tend to want people that are high in ability. Okay? These people tend to have stakes in the game. You know, you tend to rely on your coworkers, at least I know we do in the Air Force, we rely on our coworkers oftentimes to do our jobs. So it's important for those coworkers to be high in ability. So what this shows, and all of this is actually, I forgot to mention, all of this is under a low workload condition. So we manipulated workload, high and low, and this is what we find in the low workload condition. People are able to differentiate trustworthiness very, very well, actually. I was surprised at these numbers and very excited about it. When you look at high workload, so when you stress people out, you give them too much to do, the trustworthiness attributes are less sensitive individually, but collectively they're still very sensitive. So people are still processing these. You see on the neutral, this is where people wouldn't have any, they weren't necessarily high on any of these values. None of those people really, with few exceptions, are being slotted in these roles. So this really shows that some of the trust relationships do depend on the type of relationship you're talking about. Now, this is the first of several studies. I actually begged them to get some data because I wanted to talk about this in this briefing. But this is the first set of data. This is from the Australian group. And you may wonder, well, why are they really looking at cognitive load? What does that have to do with anything here? The motivation to look at cognitive load was that we think there's a hypothesis that cognitive load may actually amplify cross-cultural trust differences. Okay? Think about that for a second. if we're under high stress, if we're highly loaded, we may actually rely more on our biases than we would when we're not loaded. So we're going to test that empirically using these 3 different samples. Obviously, we can't talk about the cultural differences here today. Tune in next year, and I'll give you that brief to talk about those differences. Okay, so how am I doing on time? Okay. Okay, the next grant, and this is actually a grant that's not even issued yet. This is a grant that's in progress. This shows you how new some of these trust topics are for this portfolio, is looking at the notion of benevolence within a human-machine context. And I think it's important to tell a story here real quick. So I was recently in Japan, and the Japanese are experimenting with a driver safety system that will actually intervene if it detects that the person's not taking an action they should. It will intervene. It will take over your car. Okay? Now, in simulation studies, and you may speculate on this, people were a little resistant to that idea. Okay, but what are the Japanese doing? They're making that notion transparent to the people. They don't know the system is out to do that. It's kind of a surprise to them. What if we make that benevolence apparent to people? How does it change the human-machine interaction? Does it change it? I think this is an empirical question. Does it make people feel supported by technology? The inverse is it could make people feel manipulated. So in this project with David Atkinson at IHMC, they're going to actually operationalize benevolence in a human-machine context and manipulate it and see what effect it has in experimental studies. This is in collaboration with Peter Hancock and Deb Billings, 2 people that had a recent 2011 meta-analysis in trust and automation. So these are some pretty high-level people, as well as Robert Hoffman from IHMC. Okay, so let's transition a little bit to influence. General Flynn and many others have talked about the need, including Dr. Mayberry talks about the need of understanding the precursors of war and thinking about your social radar concept. What are the triggers for attitudes and behaviors, and what are those triggers in different parts of the world for different cultural groups? Some of the operational challenges. The DoD currently lacks some precision in culture-based influence. Okay? What that tells me is we need a science base. When you go out and talk to the people in the field in the military information support operations, they talk about the lack of cultural awareness, the lack of tools to support this. Tools is one thing, but without the data to support the tools, you're not going to get very far. So it tells me a science base is needed. We need to truly understand this cultural influence piece. We know from the Military Information Support Operations Group that target audience analysis is a key requirement. They need to understand what it is about these groups that drives their behavior. And of course, within the Air Force Targeting Center of Air Combat Command, they want to know about the quantification of behavioral effects for influence. So can we actually put a number against some of these things? Kind of cool stuff. Okay, so why is this a hard challenge? Well, we know that manipulation of influence tactics isn't plausible or ethical in the field. You can't just go out there and willy-nilly start doing things to people and see what happens. And people tend to frown upon that, surprisingly. But you might be able to do that in the lab. Okay? But the problem with lab studies is they don't always generalize very well to the field. So you've got this complication here. This tells me multidisciplinary and multi-method approaches are critical to understanding research in this domain. One-shot studies aren't going to do a whole lot of good. You need multidisciplinary approaches and multi-method approaches. Further, we know that data mining techniques and some of the modeling tools out there have at times outpaced theory. So there's a lot of work right now in social media on doing data mining. That's great to give you an understanding of what's happening today, currently, but it doesn't tell you why it's happening today. If we can get to the question of why, we can begin to predict. If we can begin to predict, we can begin to forecast behavior. Okay, so in terms of opportunities here, I actually see a real opportunity to revolutionize how targeting is done in the Air Force. You know, Dr. Russell talks about building technologies and science that can make Air Force capabilities irrelevant in the future. It's possible that we could change some of this.
I never said irrelevant.
Or not irrelevant, but obsolete. Obsolete. There's the word. Sorry about that. This isn't being taped, is it? Okay, so that's kind of my rationale for looking at influence. Now, when we consider influence as a domain, here's the scope. It's pretty big. If you think about it, every action we take as a military is an act of influence. Okay? We don't destroy things for the sake of destroying things. We don't engage in targets for the sake of it. We do it to influence. We do it to change behavior and attitudes. We can do that in a variety of ways, using kinetic or non-kinetic actions, using stability operations or developmental operations. We can engage in trust building. Okay? So we can engage in things like presence missions, trying to deter behavior. We could release leaflets from C-130s and see how that changes behavior. But ultimately, no matter what we do, the effectiveness of that tactic is going to depend on the target audience. So we need to understand their value systems and their beliefs, understand their behavioral patterns and their cultural narrative. Now, one of the things that also makes this pretty complex is the notion of these enabling factors like social media. We all know social media is pervasive. We know it's influential. We don't necessarily know why. Some of the theory is just not here yet. So my strategy in looking at influence is to focus on these outer layers of the triangle here, with the hope of down the road, many years down the road, being able to get enough empirical data that we can actually leverage computational social science and some of the strengths of the modeling community, which is quite strong, to build some tools, some no-kidding tools for the Air Force. Obviously, this is going to be in partnership with a whole host of people. It's not just a basic science issue, but my strategy is the basic science area is to get more empirical data sets. Okay. So the first project I'm going to talk about in the influence realm is a project by Jason Lyle of Yale University. And he developed a method to evaluate the impact of kinetic and non-kinetic air operations. His approach was he developed a matching algorithm that could match a village in Afghanistan to one that had an event and compare that to one that didn't have an event. Okay? These villages would be comparable in terms of the size of the village, its geography, its pre-existing violence levels, socioeconomic indicators, the wealth of the area. So again, the comparison is between villages that had an event and those that didn't have an event. And in this study, the event could be defined as one that caused damage, property damage, or one that didn't cause property damage, kind of like a presence mission or a show of force. What he found was that the operations that involved property damage actually were associated with increases in attacks against ISAF forces in CENTCOM. You can see at the 15-day level, all the way up to the 90-day level, there were these increases in attacks following the event that caused the damage. And as you can see, all the way out to the 90-day point, there's actually a 19% increase in these attacks. Now compare that with the influence tactics that didn't cause any damage. There were actually no reliable differences between subsequent violence when you look at the influence actions that didn't involve any damage. Now obviously, there's a lot going on here. This is a pretty complicated story to tell. There are going to be times where you have to engage in a kinetic operation. Everybody knows that. There are going to be times when maybe it's not necessary. But in this particular study, we were looking at the effects, understanding some of the effects down the road of these different operations. Air Combat Command was pretty excited by this, and they're currently trying to explore how they can incorporate this into some of their targeting and planning tools. So another way to look at influence is to understand the antecedents of violence. In this study, I should have said this study was actually also part of a Minerva program that's I manage within the Air Force, but it's actually an OSD program as well. As is this next project. This project with David Matsumoto and his colleagues looked at the role of leader emotions in predicting violence toward an outgroup. So in this study, as we all know, dating back to Darwin and a lot of the appraisal theorists of emotions these days, emotions are associated with different action tendencies. When we feel happy, we want to share that happiness with others. When we feel sad, we want to retract and get away from social situations. When we feel angry, we want to do something about that. We want to take that anger away. When we feel disgust, we want to eliminate that disgust and distance ourselves from whatever it is that's causing that disgust. So emotions are associated with action tendencies. They make us want to do something. In this study, they actually generated a set of leader speeches as they were describing outgroups. So using historians, using different websites and different databases, they collected these set of speeches and they coded them for anger, contempt, and disgust. And all of these speeches preceded either an act of violence, act of aggression in this case, or an act of resistance, one that didn't include violence. Okay? And one of the key aspects of this study was they looked all the way out until 20 months prior to the event. So if you think about 24 months prior to an event, leader emotions as they're discussing an outgroup, all the way up to 3 months prior to the actual event. And all of these things led to some event. Some of those were violent, some of those weren't. In this study, they found that the acts of aggression, the actual events where the leader engaged in violence against the outgroup, you see a spike in the anger, contempt, and disgust 3 months prior to the event. Okay? In the events that didn't lead to aggression, these acts of resistance, you saw actually a decline in these three emotions at the 3 month prior period. Okay? So this is another way of thinking about influence. So I said earlier, when you think about influence, one of the highly relevant issues is looking at the target audience. And we know one of the highly pertinent target audience factors is understanding the beliefs that they hold sacred. So Scott Atran and his colleagues back in 2007 published a paper in Science that found when people begin to process things in a sacred way, they become insensitive to monetary incentives. In fact, the monetary incentives have the inverse effect. They make people more hostile. So at the same time, it's not well known what are the processes that might lead to something becoming sacred. So in this study, Scott Atran and his colleagues looked at the impact of conflict and religiosity on sacred value development. The hypothesis was that religious acts may actually anchor sacred values. And this is a process that might be triggered by increased threat, okay, when people feel that they're threatened in a certain situation. What they did was they surveyed Palestinians and asked about their attitudes towards Israeli-Palestinian issues. If a person, so some of the issues were recognition of Israel as a Jewish state, right of return for the refugees, sovereignty, these very sensitive topics. Now, if a person reported great opposition to these issues, they weren't willing to compromise at all, they were classified as a moral absolute. And that binary variable became the dependent variable in a logistic regression, which I'll describe in a second. So they also asked about their perceived threat, whether the Palestinians should feel constantly in danger, and they asked about their religious practices. What they found was that there was actually an interaction of perceived threat and religiosity in predicting the sacred values, this binary classification. So what they found was at low threat, there were no differences between those high and low in religiosity. But when people perceived high threat, there were significant differences between people high and low in religiosity. So what does this study tell us? It tells us that conflict may actually intensify the commitment of religious devotees to sacred values. This may be a process which anchors sacred values in these environments. Okay, so we just heard about a study including sacred values where people self-reported. They told the researchers what their sacred values were. Well, it actually came up in a talk I was giving this last Thursday. What if they were lying? What if they weren't telling the truth, right? So this study by Greg Burns looks at what are some other ways to index sacred values. And he looked at the question of whether or not we can index sacred values using functional MRI. Okay? In this study, and I'm going to look at my notes a little bit here, the subjects were exposed to a series of descriptive statements. Okay? Statements like, I'm a dog person, I'm a Coke person, I'm a Mac person. A lot of people like their Macs, right? I believe in God. You know, these things ranged from mundane to very sacred. Okay? So they were exposed to these statements, and their fMRI, their neural activity, was measured while they were exposed to these statements. Then, each statement was paired with its inverse. So, I'm a dog person, I'm not a dog person. Okay? I'm actually a dog person, but recently my dog has been getting into the trash. So it may not be a value that's sacred to me. I may be willing to get rid of that value. And that's exactly what he did in this study. He gave people the opportunity to get real money, again, real money, for people to simply sign a statement saying, you know what, I take it back. Let's use the example of I believe in God. If you said I believe in God, would you be willing to accept money to sign a statement saying that you don't believe in God? Okay? That was one way to index sacred values. Okay? And if they refused to contradict that statement, so if they refused to sign that statement saying they don't do that statement, that was a proxy for whether that value was sacred or not for these individuals. And so what did they find? He found that the values that people refused to sell, again, these would be the values considered sacred for people, were associated with increased activity in the left temporal junction, as well as the ventrolateral prefrontal cortex. That's a mouthful at the end of the day. I apologize for that. But what does that mean? Why is that important? Well, research by Rebecca Sachs and her colleagues, published in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Science recently, found that those brain areas were actually associated with semantic rule retrieval, so right and wrong decision making. So this shows that these values in the laboratory may actually equate to or be related to brain areas associated with right and wrong decision making, also called deontological decision making. The inverse of that, the statements that they actually said, okay, I'll take some money to sign a statement saying, I oppose this, I take it back, those were associated with more left parietal region activity. And that's been theoretically shown to be associated with regions where cost-benefit analyses are predominant. Okay? And so this shows that it may actually be possible to index sacred values via neurological markers. And I'm actually running out of time a little bit, so I'm going to skip this next study and go straight into a Muri project. This is actually a Muri project that was started by Terry Lyons and Bob Bonneau. Bob talked a little bit about this earlier today. So this Muri is all about people applying complex statistics and complex models to real social problems. In this particular study, by Kristen Lerman and her colleagues, examined the utility of social network analysis metrics and understanding influence. So here, she was looking at a social networking tool called Dig. Anybody use this by chance? It's not quite as it's not quite as big as Twitter or Facebook. It's a relatively small tool, but it actually allowed. What's that?
I think we're talking about Dig, the recommender system.
Yes. And so, what she was looking at were we have different ways of measuring centrality within social networks, and she wanted to know what metrics of centrality were most influential or most predictive of influence within this network. In this case, in the y-axis, you have influence defined as reposting. So when a person posts something, this is being reposted by their friends and their other colleagues. That's one way of thinking about influence. She found that alpha centrality, which is a centrality metric that takes into account more broadcast style communications, was a much better predictor of influence relative to PageRank. Okay, don't tell Google this, but this is what she found in this study. Okay, the next study is also part of this same Muri program. This particular project led by Jeff Brantingham at UCLA. And this was motivated by the fact that they wanted to apply these sophisticated statistical models to real social problems. And they found a real social problem with the LAPD. They didn't have enough resources, enough manning to meet their demands. There was a lot of crime related to gangs within LA. This may come to surprise to some people, right? Or maybe not. So the whole notion was, how can you develop mathematical models that can actually be used to predict the impact of different influence tactics? So in this sense, the LAPD wanted to test out different ways of influencing these gang networks. Again, these were kind of social network types of analyses here. And what they did was, they looked at a situation where they had 7 gangs, and this was all based on empirical grounding and real problems with the LAPD. They looked at a situation where they had 7 gangs, 2 sets of dyads, and then 1 triad. And they set up a model where they could perturb that model to influence it in such a way where they could either take out one gang, make one gang obsolete essentially, or they could kind of influence all the gangs at once. And the question was, which one of those is going to be more effective in reducing overall crime? You might think if you've got 3 gangs fighting real intensely together, well, why don't you take out the most intense fighting gang, right? Makes sense. But in fact, actually the opposite occurs. You see, with gangs, if one gang attacks another gang, that gang retaliates. And then they retaliate. And it's a vicious cycle. So when you have dyads, when you've got 2 gangs fighting each other, there's actually more overall violence than if you've got all the gangs kind of fighting each other. And they developed this mathematical model which basically showed that and was supported by some of the empirical data that they got from the policing unit. They have a really strong collaboration there. And the policing unit is actually using some of these mathematical algorithms, as is the folks in the 711th Human Performance Wing using some of this within their forecasting CTC. So you might think, well, these are gangs. Well, what if they were villages? What if they were villages in Africa or villages in Afghanistan? You could develop these mathematical models to try to get at influence within these different network structures. Okay. So let's talk a little bit about some recent transitions, and I want to save enough time for some questions if you have them. In terms of the Air Force Minerva program, I talked about the study by Jason Lyle, the air power study. They're also doing a major study looking at the impact of developmental activities on violence. I actually briefed that last year. This was heavily cited by the 2011 Foreign Relations Committee report led by John Kerry. They talked all about their research. It was kind of cool, actually, to see that. And some of these efforts, or some of this research is directly transitioned to counterinsurgency efforts in ISAF. And of course, the air power study was transitioned to Air Combat Command. So I just spoke about the UCLA MURI program. Some of this research was featured on the ABC and NBC News, so it's getting some pretty good press. And it's also, as I mentioned, being transitioned to some of the lab researchers. I've also got a couple of programs that I didn't talk about. I talked about some of these in the last spring review. One of them is Yanir Bar-Yam, who's developing statistical models of geographic and ethnic boundaries and their role in predicting violence. Some of this was published in Science recently. He also did a study looking at the link between food costs and riots. And all this research was briefed at the Strategic Multi-Layer Assessment Community meeting, which was somewhat recently. These are warfighters within the military information support operations. So they were getting that information and they were hoping to use it in some of their models. In addition, the research by Yanir Bar-Yam was cited, I learned this recently, was cited by Wired Magazine as one of the top 10 science discoveries of 2011. So that was pretty cool. And that was referencing his work on food costs and rioting. We have work by Sandy Pentland, which I talked about in the last spring review, looking at computational methods. And some of that work is being used by DARPA in their Nexus 7 project. And I've already talked about the sacred values work. There's been a lot of success in that domain. A lot of it's being used by DARPA, as well as being briefed at some pretty senior political meetings. So I've got about 3 minutes left. I'm going to talk about some collaborations and synergies. So obviously, we're not the only one funding work on trust. The Army Research Lab is interested in trust-related interfaces and robotics. Jessie Chen down in Orlando, I'm collaborating pretty closely with her, as well as networks. I just met Kevin Chan, who's at Aberdeen, who's interested in trust and networks. So I'd like to learn more about that. The Army Research Institute is interested in trust and network teams. So again, this is mostly in the interpersonal realm. I'm actually participating in a symposium with Arwen Hunter from ARI, as well as some of her colleagues at the American Psychological Association meeting coming up in August. So there's a pretty decent collaboration there. The NICTA group. So this is a group in Australia that's very prolific in terms of the research communities. They're doing a lot of developmental work in the area of autonomous systems, and they have some work on trust and cognitive load. That's the work that I'm actually funding for them. NAVAIR, they have interest in trust and culture. So Sandra Hughes, Joan Johnson, that group down in Orlando. Mentioned that IARPA is looking at a large initiative on the physiology of trust. ONR, Paul Bellow, has a lot of interest in machine ethics. AFRL, obviously I came from AFRL, or I came from RH actually, the Human Effectiveness Directorate, and trust is a key research area for them. I have a pretty close collaboration with them. A lot of that work is now being led by Charlene Stokes back in Wright-Patterson. In terms of the influence domain, so ONR is funding some research in this area. I've got a fairly close collaboration with Ivy Estabrook. Actually, the Greg Burns study on the neuroscience of violence, we're actually co-funding that. So that's an area of strong collaboration. Looking at DARPA, they have some interest in culture, but it's more focused on neuroscience and training. OSD has a very large program on modeling. Their human social cognitive behavioral program, led by Captain Dylan Schmaro and Ivy Esterbrook. It's a very robust modeling effort, so largely in the 6.2 and 6.3 domain, but I figured they're doing a lot of the modeling work. Maybe I can help them with some empirical data sets. Department of State has interest in social media. Air University and the Air Force Language and Culture Center is very much interested in language and culture, as is the Defense Equal Opportunity Management Institute down in Florida at Patrick. I think the take-home message is that a lot of these things are focused on training. There's not actually a large body of science in the basic research area that's building data sets to feed some of this cultural influence, but it's largely based on training. And with that, I see my time is running out, and I'll take any questions.
Okay, questions? Yes. Thank you. Real important work. A couple of areas that are of high interest to the Air Force right now is resilience. It's resilience of the human coming back from the war zone. Related to that is historic high rates of suicide.
Right.
It seems that trust and influence would be really, really important in those. Could we perhaps add some more bullets or some more collaborations on those areas?
That's a great point. I appreciate that comment. In fact, the person in the Human Effectiveness Directorate that's leading the resiliency effort for the Air Force, Kevin Eshelman, was actually somebody that I hired into the system. So I have a close collaboration with him. I'd love to add to the portfolio in that area. That'd be at the discretion of course, my leadership to see whether that fits in strategically. I think that's a huge need area. In fact, if you look at suicides, one of the big impediments to people leveraging the resources available to them is stigma and also trust of the institutions. So I think this notion, again, coming at this from a basic research perspective, I think the notion of trust in institutions may be a solid basic research vector for that resiliency topic. But I'd be happy to help and collaborate with that. Yeah.
Actually, that's a good segue to the to the question I would like to ask. In 2008, Thomas Madden wrote a book. The beginning of the title was Empires of Trust, which compared the Roman Empire in the time when it was a republic with the United States. And the point was that nations trust each other to behave in certain ways, and there are certain examples of that. So is there any possibility in your program then of expanding it to the research of what develops trust between nations? And that's something that you're hearing in the news even today, if you picked up today's paper, meetings between heads of nations and trust in what they are going to do, as opposed to what they say. So are you going, this is a really important area, and is there any part of your portfolio that examines that, or is going to examine it?
So the question is there anything in my portfolio that looks at more of the higher level trust between nation states? There's not anything currently. I think one of the challenges in that particular question is operationalizing trust in that context. One of the strengths of the trust literature as it currently stands is you can operationalize it as it relates to individuals in those sorts of, or groups. So I think that's going to be one of the challenges. I'd be happy to explore that particular topic. But currently I don't have any research in that area.
Joe, just to pick up on the question of resilience, then ask my question. There is a Defense Science Board study that's going to come out, I think, but for others' benefit, that's focused on preventing violent behavior, and it includes, it's motivated by Fort Hood, but it includes actually a series of the nation's top neuroscientists that are looking at, among the things, well, that's probably all I should say because it's not yet public, but it should be hopefully within the next few months. My question is just related to the cross-cultural work that you were, and it is related in part to this nation-state question, which is you showed an example of Malaysian versus U.S. versus Australian study, and one of the issues, and I guess I'm curious about what independent variables are looking at in that work, because obviously there's, there are collectivist versus individualist cultures. China, just as an arbitrary example, is very different than the U.S. in terms of that. There's also environments, hierarchical environment versus an egalitarian environment. Let's say military versus academic, for example. So I'm just curious, is that study looking, what are the independent variables in that study, and do you have sufficient representation to ensure you're getting at the right cross-cultural data for whatever indicators you're looking at?
Excellent question. I appreciate that. So in the trust literature, one of the areas that has been looked at to some extent with survey work is the difference between individualistic and collectivistic cultures. And the finding that stands out is the notion that collectivistic cultures adhere to more benevolent strategies in developing trust. And so in this study, that drove the interest obviously in Malaysia as the more collectivistic culture. The U.S. typically, according to Hofstede and some of the studies there, more individualistic, and Australia included as a Western comparison. So is it just that since all these models are based on Western samples essentially, do we see the same thing in Australia? So the justification was looking at kind of this individualistic versus collectivistic notion. The independent variables you asked about, so relationship type was one, culture is one very large one. We're going to be looking at culture both within the nation perspective, so separating Malaysian versus US versus Australian. We're also collecting cultural value data. So based on some of the Hofstede types of measures, our collaborator, Mei Lin, she's an expert in that particular area, so she's bringing in some of the assessments for that particular domain. And also cognitive workload, and I think that's all for the independent variables for that study.
Okay, let's thank our speaker again.